music, not diving, with Scuba.
Just before we get started, a word from our sponsor. AC55ID.com is the fastest growing electronic music marketplace, the central hub for buying music, selling music, and listening to music. Yeah, 1 cent per stream is the payback rate over there, and they also pay that for podcasts. So if you're watching this on AC55ID.com, then we're getting paid. So thanks for that, because it's not the case anywhere else. They also have a pressing plant, so if you're doing vinyl, then, well, you can work with them on it. They can fulfill fan-powered orders on demand for vinyl. That is pretty amazing. As a label or an artist, when you're selling on the platform, you keep 100% of your sales. There's no commission. There is a monthly fee, but as a viewer of Music Not Diving, they are waiving that fee for the first 6 months. Just use the code SCUBA6 when you sign up. Head over to AC55ID.com to check them out.
Brought to you by AC55ID.
Welcome to the show. I'm Scuba. This is Music Not Diving, or I should probably call it farming, not diving, actually, because this episode is very far outside of my comfort zone. It's very far outside of my area of expertise. I knew absolutely nothing about regenerative farming before I started researching this episode. It is fascinating, though. I mean, it's interesting from a musical perspective because the subject of this conversation, or the person I'm talking to, is a very successful musician. It's Andy Cato, half of Groove Armada, one of the most successful electronic acts, probably of all time, actually. Just amazing catalogue of huge tunes. Andy, however, has been a farmer, though, for the last 15 years, as well as doing Groove Armada. And farming is just the kind of farming that he does anyway, is absolutely fascinating, I discovered when I was researching this. So fear not, this is a chat which does have some music in it, but is just packed full of truly fascinating insights into, regenerative farming. So I'm not going to say too much more than that because, as I said, this is not my area of expertise. Andy's an amazing guy with a huge amount of knowledge on the subject and the way it interacts with other subjects which you may be interested in too, without wanting to be too specific. And yeah, this is an unexpected but very, very good episode of this podcast. So let's just get into it, shall we? Just before we do that, though, a reminder that you can support the show on Patreon, patreon.com/ScubaOfficial. There are 2 tiers there, the more expensive of which gets you all of the music that we release on Hot Flush Recordings. So if you want to support the show and get some great music, well, that's the thing to do. You could also send us a one-off donation if you were wondering about that. There's a link in the show notes to do that. And there's a Discord server you can join too, hotflushrecordings.com/Discord. What we really want you to do, though, to be honest, is hit like on this video and subscribe to the channel. So if you could do that, please. And when you've done it, let's head over to the studio and talk to Andy Cato. Andy Cato, welcome to the show. How you doing?
Great to be here.
Yeah, thank you for coming down. You've obviously got we were talking off camera. You've got a busy diary today. So, I was going to say you will be most notable, I think, to most viewers as half of Groove Armada. But actually, your media commitments today may have got you a bunch more fans, right? Because you are going over to do Clarkson's farm today.
Yeah, we've been filming on that for on and off for a couple of years, and as they experiment a little bit with a regenerative farming approach, maybe we can get into a little bit about what that means later on.
Absolutely, well, yeah, 100%.
But yeah, I think the last time I was in this building, I was listening to the Idiot Boys working on some deep disco dive. I think they had a studio downstairs at one point.
Did they?
All back some memories, yeah.
Right. Okay. So, farming. I mean, like, basically, that's the majority of questions I have written down actually concerning this. Because this is interesting to me, for a number of reasons. But firstly, it's an interesting topic. And obviously, you've accrued an enormous amount of experience doing this. But also as a kind of, things people do after music, a really successful musical career, which then gives birth to something else, which is like, not just high profile, but hopefully, something which is like genuinely positive to be doing with yourself. So tell me, you've told this story, I know, a lot of times before in previous interviews, but like, what was the process of getting into this from?
Yeah, but I think that, there are, there's various articles around, musicians who, in quotes, go into farming.
Right.
I think this is a bit of a different scenario in that, well, first of all, like, when Tom and I were at our peak, it was a bit like 90s footballers, you know.
Right.
Like we were doing absolutely fine by any measure, but it wasn't like when we were headlining things like Space on Sundays, it wasn't what happens financially when you headline those things now.
Yeah,
you know?
right.
So, and also when we chose to play live, we did it with 25 musicians because we wanted to actually play, or 25 crew and musicians because we wanted
Which is
to
an
actually,
expensive show.
we wanted to actually play live, you know, and I wouldn't change it for the world, but it wasn't like, okay, I've made enough cash that I'm going to dig a moat, pull down the portcullis and dig a vegetable garden. You know, it wasn't that sort of approach at all. It was just a really unanticipated rolling kind of wave of discovery that just swept me along. I mean, basically it started when I was coming back from a gig in Eastern Europe, and I picked up an article totally at random, very well written, about the environmental consequences of food production. Not something I never really thought about before. I mean, the old newspaper article, but no idea. And I was shocked. And it had a line in it which said, if you don't like the system, don't depend on it. And that inspired me to start growing vegetables. We happened to be living in France for a load of reasons, totally, you know, again, totally random. Could live anywhere at the time, didn't make any difference.
Sure. We
had a bit of garden, and we were living in a rural area where there were other vegetable patches, so I could, you know, see a bit of inspiration.
Right.
And then basically from doing that, obviously I wasn't very good at it because I'd never planted a seed in my life, but you know, just seeing like seeds become plants and plants become food, and these miraculous processes that make that happen, and ultimately on which all life depends, certainly all of our lives depend. I just went down this rabbit hole of like reading and doing, and the vegetable patch became a market garden. I then sold all of my publishing rights to buy this farm, and on it went. But basically,
hang on a sec. So where in France were you?
I was down. The only part I was going to say at the end of that is that this wasn't after music. It was very much like I was going off to the Space Terrace and funding all these crazy farming experiments. You know?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So where in France were you?
So I was down in southwest France, so it's about an hour from Toulouse.
Gascony.
In Gascony.
Yeah.
The most rural department. Gers is the official sort of department name these days. It's the old Gascony, but it's the most rural department in France, which is saying something given when you fly over France. It's basically fields.
Yeah, right. Okay. So, I mean, a lot of agriculture presumably going on there anyway. So you, as you mentioned, surrounded by people who are growing stuff. Was that, I mean, presumably there were some big farms there, but also small holders or whatever the correct term is, growing stuff for themselves. Like what was the kind of environment like in your kind of immediate?
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting, because for the first 17 years of being involved in growing food, all I knew was that little bit of France. And then when I came back to the UK and farmed here, I realized how unique that France is. Right. You know, for lots of reasons. I think, you know, an important one is the post-French Revolution legal framework, which meant that all big land holdings got split up. Yep. And so you end up with a patchwork of family farms, basically quite small. The flip side of that being they're right on the edge of being able to survive in commoditized agriculture when they're competing in exactly the same market if they're selling maize, which was the big crop down there. Yeah. And that's all because Napoleon had dug these irrigation canals down from the Pyrenees, so it became kind of the maize production center of France. Right. But they're competing with like farms in Iowa or something. Yeah. Where, you know, the entire size of these kind of French farms would be where they park their tractor. Yeah. You know, so it's difficult for them. But they say it was a really, interesting, combination of, farms where they're using every kind of chemical in the tool bag and as modern machinery as they can afford relative to the size, but also they've still got the veg patch, there's chicken running around the farmyard, they're still using all the original farm buildings for the same uses they've been used for hundreds of years. So it was kind of sort of 50s Britain mixed with commoditized industrial agriculture. Is a very interesting blend.
Right. Okay. And so the style of farming, I suppose, that you've become associated with and, you know, you've become very much involved in promoting. Can you describe that and what it is and why it's better, I suppose?
Yeah, well, I suppose, you know, most people have no reason to assume that the food system is a problem, you know, because the supermarkets are always full and food relative to our income is cheap as it's ever been. Yeah. And actually, I mean, I probably, won't do the whole kind of 200-year history, but essentially what happened was, chemistry and physics were miles ahead of biology in the sort of mid-19th century because you didn't have microscopes where you could see cellular activity.
Right.
So we ended up with a sort of chemical understanding of soil. It basically keeps plants upright, and it's got various nutrients in it in chemical form that get dissolved by water and go into the plant. Therefore, if we put on more of those nutrients in artificial form, fertilizers, we can make the plants grow much more vigorously and get much more crop. And this was all happening. This is definitely not an official history of agriculture, but just to give you the outline.
Absolutely. Yeah.
This is all happening at a time when there's huge migration into the cities because of the Industrial Revolution.
Yep.
And so there's also a question of like, how are we going to feed all these people with much fewer farm workers? So it seems like the dream solution, and over the years, various things compounded that. A big one being like,
Sure, you mean fertilizers, basically.
So we've got this sort of chemical understanding of soil.
Yeah.
It seems to work. Like you put this stuff on, you get more out. You're losing farm workers to the cities.
Yeah.
This is perfect.
And that's sort of the quote unquote efficient way of.
It seems to be, yeah, it seems to be. And also, but if you're doing it like that and you're using fertilizers and you're using machines and you're using fewer people, plus the fact that you've got a kind of colonial global commodity system shipping stuff around, it suits you to start specializing. So rather than growing lots of different things on your farm, well, I'm just going to grow loads of wheat. Right. Or whatever, and just keep it simple as I can. And I've got these fertilizers, all of that inconvenient stuff I used to have to do, have a load of animals so I had enough fertility to grow the wheat. I can forget that now. I can just do this. And for a while, it worked. And from a farmer's perspective, when you've been doing the hard yards of actual sort of day-to-day husbandry, this arrives like a miracle.
Right.
And a miracle it was for a while. But then what we kind of started to realize, decades ago now, is that essentially the soil isn't an inert thing keeping plants up. It's actually, the home of a vast amount of terrestrial life. And that if you have a food system that's based on suppressing and killing and replacing all of that life, it starts to have profound consequences. And then the crops start getting ill. And then we use the kind of legacy of chemical weapons repurposed to kill the, in quotes, pests that were attacking the crops, but they were only attacking the crops because the crops were growing in soil that wasn't working anymore.
Right.
And so then we get into a bit of a death spiral. And by the 60s, you had like Rachel Carson writing The Silent Spring about how spring has literally become silent. And, fast forward now. And, in my teens, we had...
Sorry, the Silent Spring. Silent because not as many insects?
All the insects have gone, yeah.
Right. Okay.
Insects have gone. And then, in my lifetime, since then, we've lost 2/3 of all wildlife, and agriculture is front and center of that.
I mean, it's crazy. The most, this is obviously often commented on, but the most visible, sort of evidence of the lack of insects is like on the windshield, right? And, this is not something that people generally think about. It's something that I generally think about, but it has, various points kind of come into my mind that when I was a kid in the sort of 80s and 90s, you went on holiday south of France and your windshield would just be covered, and it's just not there anymore, isn't it? I mean, this is an obvious point, I realize, but just from a, I guess a visual representation of what has happened, it's just
I think
stark.
That's right. And I think the really, the good news is that we know everything we need to know to turn this around. And I think an really important point is that, having been on the sort of sharp end of this now for 17 years or so, what we absolutely can't do is either blame farmers or put the solution on the farmers. They've been in an economic system since World War II where it's been like yield at all costs. We got into a point where there's an endless abundance of cheap food, whatever the environmental cost, really suited governments. I mean, governments love cheap food. And so the whole incentive of economics was created to make farmers do that. So if we want farmers to do something else, we have to help them do that.
Right. Okay. Just staying on the history for a bit. The American agricultural sector is, I guess, the sort of the actual kind of like the Death Star of this stuff, right? I'm not sure if that's a fair comment, but it seems having done a little bit of reading on this that it possibly is. And this was a Nixon era change of policy. Is that correct? I'm not sure if I'm completely on the right track here, but can you just explain, the American side of it? Just to satisfy my own curiosity as much as anything else.
Yeah, well, again, it's interesting. Like if you go back a little bit earlier, so in the early part of the 20th century, there was a thing called the Dust Bowl, where the Great Plains, so these grasslands that had built up millennia of fertility thanks to sort of great herds of herbivores coming through and grazing, and you ended up with this thick black soil, bison, exactly, this thick fertile soil. And then when it was ploughed, it became very fragile and it started blowing away, and you had this Dust Bowl phenomenon. There was a very memorable moment when a guy was testifying in Congress about the need to protect America's soils, and as he was speaking, the biggest of the dust storms blew in across the whole, from one side of the continent to the other, and blotted out the sun. And Congress went black, and he pointed to the window and he said, "This gentleman is what I'm talking about." Wow. And so at that time, you had like the U.S. Department of Agriculture sending people off to look at like Korea and Japan and China. And one of those people wrote a book called The Farmers of 40 Centuries, 4,000 years. And he's saying these people have maintained fertility on this land for 4,000 years. We're like 40 years in and it's all blowing to Washington. What are we doing? And there was very much a kind of soil focused thing. Like the Department of Agriculture was saying, imagine if a foreign power came and stole 90,000 acres. This is what's happening every year with soil loss. Right. And then, on both sides of the Atlantic, really, just before the Second World War, there were voices in Europe, in the UK, like Lady Balfour, who was a big figure in the organic movement, lots of voices in the States saying, we can see which way this is headed, this sort of, this food production based on the suppression of nature with chemistry. And, but then the Second World War literally blew it out of the water. And then after the Second World War, you got into a thing where, again, there was a fear of a massive expanding population. We just need to make sure we can feed them. And then that subtly merged into geopolitics as the West used this chemical agriculture, which basically they patented pretty much in terms of the machinery and the fertilizers, as a political tool. And then you get the famous Nixon-era comment from Earl Butz, who was the Department of Secretary of State for Agriculture, who said to farmers, "Get big or get out." Yeah. And that was the kind of rip up every hedgerow, take down every tree, just optimize output.
Right. And the American agricultural sector is sometimes described as being, well, I used the word efficient before, but I suppose the efficiency is calculated by sort of manpower versus calories out. But there is a pretty, my limited reading here has led me to suggest that maybe there is a pretty significant inefficiency in energy in US farming, and actually it's not an efficient way really of doing it at all. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is. So you're quite right that you look at a person in a massive machine, master of thousands of acres single-handed, and by one measure it's incredibly efficient. We've gone from basically everyone being involved in agriculture to hardly anyone being involved in agriculture, yet we're all still being fed. Yeah. So, and
actually yields have gone up, right?
Yeah. So there's, by one measure, definitely more efficient. But as you say, if you look at the way that works is the use of fossil fuels, not just for the tractor, that's actually the smallest bit of it.
Right. It's fertilizer as well.
Yeah. Just to suppress all of the natural processes that are trying to fight back, And so when you add to that transport, packaging, blah, 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 the latest time I looked at it, and it will vary hugely, but basically it's 12 calories of energy for every 1 calorie of food.
Yeah. That's not efficient, is it?
It's not efficient. And then, of course, beyond that, ultimately, look at going back to the wildlife declines, or the fact that there isn't one UK river that's in good ecological condition. We think of sewage, but actually almost half of that is down to the way we grow food, or the way farmers are forced to grow food, I should say.
Well, so just chemical runoff.
Yeah, nitrate runoff, pesticide runoff, and stuff like that. So ultimately, no species survives the death of its ecosystem, and it's total hubris to think we will be an exception to that.
Right.
So put whatever price on that you want.
Okay. So, all right. So in practical terms, what are you guys doing about it, or what do you? I mean, that's obviously a question that I wanted to ask, but also, like, what is it? What does a realistic, sort of alternative system? What is a healthy system? What does it look like in terms of like food production and I suppose, you know, the business of food that goes along with that, you know, getting people to eat stuff which is sustainable. I mean, that's a couple of big questions, but maybe start with, what you guys are doing and like in practical terms and how it works.
I think it is important to divide it into how it's grown and then what you choose to do with it. How it's grown and what you choose to do with it. So the whole processing and all the rest of it. Otherwise, it just gets unwieldy as a sort of as a question.
Sure.
But in terms of how it's grown, I mean, it's sort of as complicated as you want and as simple as you want. Basically, what regenerative farming is doing is what the name suggests: growing food whilst regenerating the ecosystem in which that food is being grown. It was a coin that was termed in the 80s, in the States, in fact, where you recognise that actually sustaining what we've got is not adequate. We need to make it better. And essentially what that means is, and there's lots of parallels with human health, where we're just moving the emphasis back to biology. So rather than kind of using, cultivations and chemistry to essentially render the soil inert and hydroponically pretty much feed the plants that are growing in there, we're copying natural systems so that the soil can function like it does. Like when you walk through a meadow or a forest, there's this endless abundance.
Yeah.
And so if we can copy that in the way that we're farming, then we can harness that endless abundance for food production too.
Okay. So in practical terms, what does that mean?
In practical terms, the whole soil universe, is fed by sunshine. So the most fundamental thing is that as soon as soil isn't covered with plants, it's dying.
Right.
So step one is making sure that you keep soil covered with plants, and plants will then turn sunshine into sugar, essentially carbon, for that underground universe. And, again, the clue in nature, the more diverse those plants, all of those plant roots will be giving out slightly different versions of food that will foster different people different creatures in the soil universe. Exactly the same way that we now think that, we used to talk about human health in terms of our potassium sodium balance, where we've got high or low iron. And we're now saying actually it's all about biology. It's about life. It's about the gut microbiome. And we need to feed it with a diversity of plants or foods. It's exactly the same thing.
Okay. So, that's still quite abstract for the lay person. So can you take the example of maybe something that you do on your farm? Like, what does this mean in terms of in terms of what you actually practically do as a farmer? So what do you plant, and what things do you try and, actual things do you try and sort of foster?
Yeah. So if you take a simple example, like what you might have done previously would be, plant a crop in the spring, so February, March, harvest it in, say, August, and then plough that land after harvest to get rid of the weeds, so end of August, and then from end of August to the following spring, you just leave it like that. And then from a farmer's perspective, certainly this happened a lot in France where I was farming, it's all quite handy, because what will happen is the frosts will break down all that ploughed ground. And so when you come back the next spring, it's all quite powdery and it's quite easy to start all over again.
Right.
But that means you've had 6 months of the year where the soil is bare. And so the whole sort of soil universe is dying. And it's been turned upside down. So if you imagine turning the ocean upside down, you've got all the plankton at the bottom and you've got all the bottom feeders at the top.
Right. So ploughing does that, obviously, yeah.
So it does that. So between the two, you're turning it upside down and then you're not feeding it for 6 months.
Right.
It's a death spiral, But again, that was because we had a non-biological understanding of soil. There's no kind of blame in this, it's just, we just now know better and we're trying to do better. So instead of that, what you would do, would be to plant your wheat crop in the spring, say, and instead of just planting wheat, you plant a companion plant with it. Like if anyone's grown tomatoes, they sometimes put marigolds next to it to keep the insects away, so you get a bit more diversity of food going into the soil. And it also means that with different leaf sizes, you capture more sunshine. So you're you're harvesting more sunshine and feeding more of the soil universe. And then after harvest, as soon as you've harvested it, you would just drill a load of plants, as many different ones as you can afford or is appropriate, straight into the stubble, so that all of that huge amount of solar energy that's dropping on the field from the end of August until the following spring is again being harvested and is feeding the soil universe. And the consequences of that are very straightforward. The consequences of that are very straightforward, really, in that all of these creatures, and it's a mad world down there. I really encourage people to look at some videos of what's going on down there. I mean, it's definitely more strange than Mars. Okay. It's amazing. Okay. You know, like those Attenborough, sort of deep ocean stuff, where you get the maddest of creatures. It's extraordinary. Okay. And so what they're doing with all their burrowing, and comings and goings is they create this really porous sponge full of tiny little corridors and pores everywhere. And what that means is that's where you store water. So in a climate where it's going from basically droughts to floods, which it is, that means you can hang on to rainfall, store it for the crop next time, stop it going down to the village and flooding the village or the town downstream. And it masses and masses and masses of water. The difference is incredible. Right. And it's also in all these corridors and underground spaces that you have oxygen flowing to keep all this universe alive and nutrients coming and going. And that functioning system is what then allows plants to grow in a healthy fashion. And then when we eat them, we get all the micronutrients that they've been able to absorb, and you kind of get a spiraling upward cycle. Right.
Okay. Fascinating. And you mentioned animals before. So you do involve animals in this process?
Yeah. I mean, wherever possible, we encourage that, because we're working with about 150 farmers now with Wildfarmed, and we encourage them to use animals wherever they can. I was a vegetarian for 25 years, so this was a big step for me. Okay. Realizing this was required. Right. Okay. So, and is it just a case of having animals just roaming around? I mean, how does that work in practical terms? With zero knowledge of how any of this works. Yeah, well, the most straightforward example would be going back to what we said before. So we want to keep the soil covered with plants for the whole time. So we've harvested our crop and we've drilled in what's called a cover crop, which is basically a crop you're not going to harvest. It's to cover the soil, hence the name. Yeah. And so that means that come the following spring, and you want to put your next, say, wheat crop in again, then this cover crop could be, knee or even thigh high. Right. And so what animals do at that point is they come in and they turn all of that into ready-made soil food. They're like walking composting machines, basically. So it's just a way of recycling fertility. And there's all kinds of added, life that comes from going through that fermentation process in the guts of the animals. Okay. Yeah. Fascinating. So you mentioned you're working with, 150 farms in this. So it's a lot of what you do now going out, and I suppose, is educating the right word? I'm not sure if that's, I don't know. How do you see what you're doing now to, I guess, promote this style of farming? Yeah, well, because originally it was a kind of a solo effort. So after doing the veg and everything in France, and I sold my publishing rights, I bought this farm, and then it all went totally wrong. And I was faced with the kind of degraded soils we've been talking about from this chemical understanding of soil. I went in there with a great deal of naivety and no real plan, and everything went wrong. And what happened was that I was just invaded by weeds. Like if you look at an abandoned car park, you'll see certain type of weeds like dock leaves, thistles. Nature's got this brilliant plan where there are these plants that are fantastic at taking knackered conditions, making them a bit better and a bit better and a bit better. So if you go back to the car park in 30 years, it's a forest or it's a wood. Yeah. And these are the plants that we call weeds, of course. Sure. And the worse your soils get, the better those plants grow and the worse your crops grow. I was in that loop, didn't want to use chemicals, didn't really have a holistic plan how not to. It was terrible. So 3 or 4 years in, I was exhausted. I was flying to sort of space every weekend and trying to keep things going. But there's a lot of zeros on checks in farming, especially when it's not going well. No doubt, yeah. And so that all went wrong, and then I came across some of these earlier texts from the 1930s and 40s, went down a long road of experimentation to try and farm in a kind of biological understanding of a life focused way. And, eventually that started working, and we had a farm bakery and a shop. And the reason why I did that, sorry, go on.
Yeah, I did. What was the most important change that you made then? That what was the kind of eureka moment, if there was one, if it happened like that?
Well, there were various ones. I mean, the first book that I read was by a guy called Albert Howard, who was a sort of diplomat sent to India in the early part of the 20th century. But the long and short of his book was, nature works by having a diversity of animals and plants in the same place at the same time. And then from him, he was quite an inspirational guy on that scene. From him, I did a lot more reading on that stuff and came to the conclusion that I needed to heal the soils. I needed to have pastures of diverse plants. I needed to get them grazed by cows. I needed to do all these other experiments with cover crops, the things we've been talking about, and all the rest of it. And so went down this road. But part of that was the introduction of some grazing cattle. And I was a vegetarian, 20 years standing at the time. And the time came when I had to drive my first cow myself to the abattoir.
Yeah, okay.
And that was pretty heavy.
Yeah.
And it was this little local abattoir, and you have to get there the night before. I went as late as I could to try and minimize the stress to the animal. I thought I was just going to kind of hand it over to people in white coats, but it was all pretty lo-fi, and there was just a guy saying, let's take it round the back. I went round the back, and there's a little pen of sheep, a little pen of pigs, and then this massive cow of the breed that was the favourite breed down there, the thing called Blonde Aquitaine, these huge white cows. I had this little kind of native breed type version. Yeah. Anyway, so I was shuffling my one through the gates and the pens because I wanted it to go first in the morning. Yeah. And then I stood there until it was darkness, and it was a couple of hours, and it was a moment of profound introspection. Yeah. Do I actually believe what I've been saying to people about this being essential? And then over the following years, we'd have this thing once the farm bakery was going, where I would say to the school kids who come visit, I go to the neighbouring farm. They were growing like organic soybeans and wheat on rotation. Anyone who can find anything that moves, like, free reign of the pain au chocolat, basically, when you come back. And they just wouldn't, and then we go out to the pastures where all this sort of healing was taking place, and it was just humming with life. So in terms of our overall relationship to the natural world, I remain persuaded that animals as part of a farming system are really important. That doesn't change the fact that 99.9% of the meat that we eat now is an environmental catastrophe. Yeah, right. So we need to be really careful about what animals we're talking about and in what context.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I mean, because factory farming of that sort as well is as bad as anything that goes on in
and the fact that they're fed, these are herbivores and grass eaters eating grains. Yeah. And 2/3 of the world's harvested grains are fed to animals. Right. In terms of land use, it's a madness. Yeah. Anyway, that wasn't the question that you asked, was it? It was about what we're doing to...
exactly.
So the reason why I mentioned all that was because I set up the farm bakery in the shop because when I went to sell the wheat that was finally growing in these sort of nature-rich landscapes with demonstrably more biodiversity and soil health and all this stuff, when you go to sell it, no one's bothered. I couldn't believe it. They just say, like, how many tons have you got?
Right, okay.
Doesn't matter how you grew it.
I mean, you can understand that, I suppose. Yeah. Right, yeah.
But what a mad way to build a food system.
Yeah, right.
There's no, like, Darth Vader in all this. It's just where we've ended up, you know.
Sure.
And so I was like, okay, well, this is ridiculous. I need to add value to the fact that this is a bit different. Yeah. And so I started making flour. But then the local bakers were pretty fixated on baguettes, and they just wanted their high gluten, reliable flour. A lot of them actually are tied into contracts they can't get out of, and so on and so forth. Anyway, so I ended up making bread. And it was when Ed and George, who I set up Wildfarmed with, were in the farmyard, and we were watching people coming and going, and they were using their food choices. And this is not £7 sourdough. This is a very poor part of France, you know, so they're just normal people using their food choices, either because it tastes good, because it's more digestible, because they like the way we're farming it, whatever it was. Yeah. And we were like, well, this is great, but, you know, we've got a massive ecological crisis here. How can we make this a choice for people on the high street? And how can we make this a choice for as many farmers as want to do it? And that was what led to Wildfarmed being formed.
Got it. Did you get any pushback at any point in that kind of early period? I mean, obviously, you know, well, I was going to say rural communities, but communities generally can be a little bit conservative, you know, it doesn't matter where they are, actually. Like, so did you get much or any skepticism or any kind of actual sort of hostility to what you were doing at all?
In France, it was the farmers, the local farmers mainly laughed at me. I mean,
Okay.
having said that, there was an amazing solidarity. Farming is so damned hard.
Yeah.
It is so hard.
So there's a respect there.
There's a respect there. Like, you might differ wildly on how you're going about it. But when the shit hits the fan, which it does often, certainly where I've farmed in France and the UK, everyone will be there to help you. Right. And all the sort of differences go out the window. Okay. That doesn't mean they wouldn't laugh at me when I start doing my next mad experiment, but there's that real solidarity, there. So that, I guess, it's not so much pushback. It's like, on a farming side, it's about creating an environment where change is possible and feels interesting. And from a consumer side, it's basically just explaining that our food choices have such potential to transform our futures for the better. And I just want more people to know that.
Sure. Okay. So in terms of, I'm just trying to remember those two massive questions I asked you. The second part of one of the questions was, getting into the kind of food industry, I suppose. Yeah. Because, I mean, you guys sell flour now, don't you?
And bread.
Yeah, and bread. So, I mean, obviously that's part of, I suppose, I'll answer the question. But in terms of, I suppose, changing the pattern, the wider patterns of consumption so that, the food that is eaten is more sustainable. I mean, what does that look like, do you think? And, how can you influence it?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to stick with the bit that we're doing. Sure. Otherwise, it just gets massive.
Yeah.
But I think it's a good example of where we're at and the opportunities and the problems. So, from a farming perspective, we built up this farming community one by one. I was driving around when I came back to the UK from France with the family. I was driving around the UK in a very small red Suzuki, which is completely inappropriate for a man of my size. But speaking to farmers one at a time, and essentially, to sort of really shorten down the expansion of the farming community, what's become clear is that you need a combination of lots of things. You need to make it work economically. You need to provide a real sense of community and purpose. If you want people to do something different, it's when you're in the school playground, you're doing something different. It takes a lot of courage, and that just applies throughout life, so that sort of sense of community. And then there's the sort of technical advice that goes with that. And once you have that farming community, the next question is, well, we say we're going to farm regeneratively. Anyone can use that word.
Yeah.
What do you mean? And so then we had to define what we meant. So it meant drawing up what Wildfarmed regenerative standards mean and getting them audited. So we had a trusted regenerative supply, and then start going to, artisan bakers, Michelin-starred chefs, building it up slowly until you've got enough of a voice to even have a conversation with a supermarket. But from a consumer perspective, for people, if you're going to say to people, your food choices can change your health, they can change biodiversity, they can change, our future resilience and climate and so on and so forth. People are like, cool, where do I get it from then? Right. And when you go onto the high street, you have all this choice. But a choice that you don't have is knowing who grew your food and how they grew it.
Right.
Hardly ever.
Yeah.
Particularly not in the world of like grains and flour and bread. Obviously exceptions, but basically nowhere on a high street level. And so it was really hard for us to build a supply chain so that once we got the grain off these farmers, grown the way we wanted it, signed off by the auditor, improving nature and, carbon and blah, 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 keep it traceable all the way through, get it milled, keep that traceable, and then on a supermarket level, you go into this world of companies that make the 12 million loaves that we eat every day. And they're also on really tight margins, doing really high volumes. Mm-hmm. So when we turn up saying, can you leave the additives out? Yeah. Only use this flour, install a separate silo. They're like, really?
Yeah, right.
And so they're only going to do that, if you've built up relationships with the supermarket or whatever, where they insist that they do that. Right. So there's a lot of kind of relationship building, even just to give customers the choice on the supermarket shelf of food that comes from these kind of farming systems.
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, supermarkets. I mean, supermarkets, generally speaking, don't have the best image with regards to, I mean, lots of different things actually, but like you could, I don't think many people would be surprised to learn or, or to hear that there was some, reluctance, in the big supermarkets to this kind of thing. I mean, how's it been? How have they been? Is that image justified? Are they, open to this kind of stuff?
I mean, our experience is that, well, the first thing is like, I don't know if it's 80 or 85%, but the fact of the matter is that almost all UK food is bought in supermarkets.
Yeah, right.
And
you have no choice, basically.
Well, I mean, we've got such little ecological road left. I don't think people realise quite how little ecological road we've got left, how fragile our food system is to the changing weather just in the UK over the past 3 or 4 years. Or you look at the cocoa supply chain, it's gone up, the price of cocoa has gone up by a factor of 12 in about a year. This is what happens when wild weather hits degraded ecosystems. This is the canary in the coal mine. So we just do not have much time. And yet the positive side of that is that nature comes roaring back when you give it half a chance. I know because I've seen it, we see it all over the place. So we can do this. But, if the whole countryside could be reorganized, so it was a series of small farms doing their own thing from which we could get our food, no one would love that more than me. But we are where we are. And so that's why at Wildfarmed, anyway, we took a very pragmatic view of like, we have to make this work in supermarkets soon. Like, it has to be a way that this kind of farming can go through the existing system rather than waiting until we build a new system.
Right.
And to be fair, like, we started in Waitrose and they've just gone all out. They've said like, we want to go big on regenerative farming. And then, and Marks and Spencer's before them, they started using our flour in their loaves when they didn't have to. They didn't have to do that, you know, and now, we're talking about to go into Tesco. And yeah, I mean, it doesn't get around the fact that if you're not selling enough and you don't hit various parameters, you're off the shelf.
Yeah, right.
I mean, the most precious commodity in supermarkets is shelf space.
Yeah.
And if you're not making enough money on that shelf space, you're off. And ultimately, the economics thing is is challenging, because if you imagine two fields, back to where we started, and one of them is contributing to river pollution and is contributing to nature loss, and the one right next door is leading to pristine water and nature abundance. The grain from those two fields is sold at the same price.
Yeah, right.
Now, what we can't do is charge loads more for the grain from the nature-rich field, because people are struggling with food prices enough already. These food prices, which are kind of artificially cheap in terms of their environmental impact, they're just embedded. So there's no option to kind of start massively increasing the price of food. So the only way to square that one off, as I see it, is the farmer in the nature-rich clean water field gets paid for the clean water and gets paid for the nature, as well as getting paid for the grain.
All polluters get penalised.
Well, but you can't penalise the polluters until you've got an option to do where you get paid for doing something else, because farmers have been pushed and pushed and pushed and pushed. Okay. They're not choosing to do this. They have no option to do this. So give people a choice first before you start penalising them.
That makes sense. Yeah, totally. Because I suppose it's easy to be reactive in the way I just was with that kind of thing, and point the finger. But I suppose, like you say, if the existing system has pushed people in this direction, then yeah.
You need a pull.
Right.
Once there's an accessible pull, then you can maybe slowly start, disallowing other behaviours, but you've got to have the pull first, I think.
Okay. I had on my list of questions is to ask you about climate change, the practical effects, and also, the net zero policy, which is the subject of some debate right now. So tell me, I mean, you talked in previous interviews a fair bit about, the visible effects, particularly for farmers, because you guys are, I guess, on the front line of this. So talk a little bit about climate change and how it's, right here, right now.
Yeah, well, I think, agriculture, in the last sort of 10,000 years or so, when agriculture has formed the basis of our civilizations, the fundamental building block of that is some degree of predictability. Now, obviously seasons will change and there'll be ups and downs and whatnot, but there is a basic seasonal predictability. And what's happened and is happening very quickly over the last sort of 4 or 5 years in particular is that we're going from long periods of relentless rainfall to like what's happening as we speak. Like on my farm, it was a really, really wet winter again. And that has quite profound impacts on the soil, on the crops, on your ability to get, you can't touch land when it's wet. So if it's wet, you literally can't plant stuff. You can't do anything. Yep. And then since it stopped raining, there hasn't been a drop of rain since the beginning of April.
Right.
You know, I mean, sunshine and showers is what, you know, April showers, isn't it? Right. You know, all these sayings that we've built up over the years, these were critical for the sort of farming calendar. And so it's not, it's too hot or it's too cold. There's a bit of that, but it's these long periods of stuck weather systems. And that's what we're starting to see. And sadly, exactly what was predicted.
Right. Okay. And so, yeah, the net zero policy, what is because I suppose there's the kind of ecological side of it and the effects that it has on business.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I'm particularly qualified to. I've just got, I guess, 2 thoughts on that. One would be that I think there's a real danger of carbon myopia, and the best illustration I've come across of this was in 19th century Prussia. They had these amazing tree scientists, and they were like the leading lights of whatever the official word for tree science is that escapes me for the minute.
Okay.
Anyway, and like timber was the big economic driver.
Yep.
So they were like using their scientific advances. How do we maximize yield?
Yeah.
And so they were like, we've basically got to rip down all these old forests and replace them with conifers, which is what they did. And so vast areas of ancient forests were ripped down, planted to conifers. And the yield of timber was absolutely amazing. So they were absolutely spot on. And if we'd measured by the metrics that we use today for farming or for other sort of nature carbon solutions, if we'd measured their carbon numbers would be amazing in terms of carbon sequestration. And it was an absolute ecological catastrophe.
Right.
And so, you know, we've got to be really careful that we include nature in this, because without sorting our biodiversity out, the two are completely intertwined. There's such a yearning for like hope and purpose, through, you know, in general. And, you know, we know, after just the little thing that we're doing, that we could have, our fields, full of healthy crops despite a changing climate because we've built all the resilience in the soil. We could have food and farming attracting the best minds because it's cool and it's aspirational. We could have headlines coming out every year about increases in species abundance and diversity rather than decreases. We could be saying to people that your food choices are part of the climate solution rather than part of the climate problem. It's such a good news story.
Yeah, right.
It's the best possible return on investment. So I just feel that there's a kind of eco-populism or something. Just like get out there and tell this story. And so rather than endlessly sort of trade-offs, seeing a trade-off between, sustaining the ecosystems on which we all depend and economics, just we've got to get rid of this ludicrous false choice and replace it with the news story that's just waiting around the corner.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it does seem like a false choice, doesn't it? Yeah. But that's those are the terms that seem to be set of the debate, like for some reason. I mean, I kind of scratch my head as to why it needs to be.
I think, but is it based on 2 assumptions? You know, one is that, business as usual, can continue. It can't. And perhaps the second assumption is that, you know, living in relationship to the natural world where you're collaborating with it rather than suppressing it is a kind of sackcloth and ashes story of, you know, wearing like hair shirts and only eating stale wholemeal.
Right.
It's just not. It's just much more fun on every level.
Okay. Totally. Okay. We got to talk about music. Just before we talk about music, rewilding, just explain that to me and how it relates to what you've been saying. This is just a question I had because I have no idea what that is, and people tend to talk about that as well in sort of binary terms. So.
Yeah, so I guess the idea of rewilding is you literally just take land that was farmed and you walk away from it and you leave it. I mean, there's slight variations within that, but basically you do that. And there's many sites on which this has happened, and you can measure like really striking nature recovery as that farmed land does what the car parks did that we were talking about before. It slowly moves through the kind of successional stages back towards, woodland and all of the rich habitat that comes with that and all the animals that come with that. And there's a statistic where there's like, this is not quite right, but there's something like 20% of farmland in the UK that provides 3% of the calories or something.
Right.
And so some people argue that land is actually better served to just be a really nature-rich habitat. I'm staying out of that debate because we've got enough on, and I don't know enough about it. But basically, the idea of rewilding is there's definitely places where it can massively contribute. Right. My concern is that we need to be careful we don't get into this narrative of we have a choice between nature and food.
Okay.
Because actually, in terms of building like resilient food systems and farming systems, we can only do that when we combine the two in the same place at the same time, using the diverse cover crops we were talking about, planting your wheat with companion plants. So when our farmers do that, for example, Bristol University measured the insects in our fields, and there was a doubling of insects last year, and bees went up by a factor of nearly 4.
Wow.
So we don't have to choose between nature and food. I think that's a really important thing that people realize.
Yeah, amazing. I mean, it feels like, as mentioned, we can talk about music, and it feels quite trivial. Asking you a bunch of questions about, dance music and stuff. But you mentioned that, in the kind of early years of you farming, trying to juggle the two things. How has it been, generally speaking, pursuing your music career, because you do still have a music career, a pretty successful music career, actually. Yeah. How do these two things interact with each other? And do you sometimes think that one is trivial next to the other?
I definitely don't think one is trivial next to the other. No, I don't. Because I think that these amazing moments of togetherness that I've been lucky enough to experience thousands of since the sort of free parties of the late 80s and early 90s are just more important now, possibly than they ever were, in such a sort of divided online world. But this actual human collective togetherness is a special thing that's never left me, and I don't think it's at all trivial. I think it's the very essence of being alive. And then in terms of like my relationship with it, it's not been easy, and some of it was just exhaustion. Like when you're getting up at 5 o'clock in the morning, Monday to Friday, and you go to bed at 5 in the morning at the weekend again and again.
Yeah, it's just not a sustainable lifestyle.
It's hard, and then there was a bit later on when Wildfarmed started and we got investors involved, where a bit of my brain was thinking, I need to do these gigs because that's what I'm living off. Still what I live off. I still live off DJing. But if like the investors see that I'm doing these gigs, they might, I knowing all the time that I couldn't give another waking hour to the Wildfarmed and farming project. It's just not possible for me to apply myself anymore to it. I had this sort of mad thing in my head where I was a bit worried about the perception of conflict.
Right.
What I've actually realized, is that we've got a really good news story to tell here. And the fact that I'm still involved in this, that I've done this for a very long, music I'm talking about for a very long time. I had a life where I could have just taken it pretty easy, gone and lived in Ibiza and had let's face it, a really nice time. And I chose to do something really damn hard. Yeah. People are like, why on earth are you bothering with that? So it's a good way into the story. And so I think actually in terms of sort of spreading the message, which so desperately needs to be spread, it's working really well now. But actually, on a personal level, I'm loving DJing at the moment. I absolutely love it. It's such a release from all this other stuff, which is really difficult. I'm also like, me and Tom have been blessed to do this together for like 30 years, doing it with your best mate for 30. It's just an amazing thing. And like for a very long time, that's felt infinite. that lovely feeling when you're out on the town on Saturday night, you're sharing all these experiences with your mate, the whole town's on the move, you're part of it, all that expectation. Mm-hmm. And that felt like it would just go on forever. And I'm now, I'm 52, it isn't going on forever. And so that really sort of ramps up my appreciation of it to 11 these days.
Has it affected the music making process at all in any kind of conscious way?
The farming stuff?
Yeah.
I mean, it has knocked it back. There's no doubt about that.
I mean, no doubt you have less time to do it. I sort of mean in the kind of headspace you're in when you're, making tunes. Like, has there been any kind of perceptible, underlying change to your relationship with music? I suppose that's what I'm asking. But the making of music in particular. I think
it's gone through ways. Like when I look back at the beginning of the farming stuff, I was living in France, as we discussed, and I sat at this local rock band, and I was singing for the first time, and writing, in quotes, proper songs right. for the first time. And a lot of the lyrics there were very political. Mm. And so there's clearly something between there and the vegetable patch, which I was moving in a direction. That's also when we did the Black Light album, which was the kind of coming together of 15 years really of trying to combine electronics with a rock and roll band, but it had a kind of sort of heaviness and weight to it as well. And so I think during that sort of transitional bit, how the music was being made was kind of fitted with a slight change in mood in my life about finding these things out, which I thought were really, really important. I think since it's got going, and the combination of like pressures on time and also just a real loving of the DJ thing again. Me and Tom have gone into sort of house music focused sort of zone where I suppose that, it just means that when we do what we've always done really, which is generally going to I've been so nomadic that I haven't really got a studio, but he's got this studio in Stoke Newington in the bottom of his house. And when we go over there and the fridge is full of cold beers and it's literally house music all night long, I just love it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's making music is just one of life's great joys anyway, isn't it, really?
Yeah.
Regardless of anything else. Last question, because we are a little bit pushed for time. I know you've got to go off and film with Jeremy Clarkson. Actually, let me just ask you about Clarkson first. Like, what is your experience about working with this sometimes maligned figure?
Well, I mean, it all came out of the blue. And I went over there because his farm is about 40 minutes from mine. He'd popped over it's actually a local baker who introduced us, who was making bread for Jeremy's shop. And he said, you should go and see this Andy bloke who's doing all this weird stuff. So he came over to have a look and then asked me over to his place for a cup of tea. And then the cameras were rolling and it's like, okay, here we go. And so, we were walking out into the field and I was thinking about what we could do to sort of set up what we were talking about. And actually one of the best things you can do and viewers, listeners can try this for themselves as long as they don't piss the farmer off. But if in a field, you dig up some soil from the field itself and you go back to the hedgerow, the undisturbed soil, and dig up some soil from there and you put them next to each other, almost without exception, what you'll see is from the hedgerow, dark, sweet-smelling, crumbly, porous, rain-capturing, life-giving soil. And the other one will probably smell slightly sulphurous and be a bit slabby and just obviously they're sort of vibrant and resilient. So we did that. And then we started doing some regen farming in his fields. And, he's an incredibly bright guy and very perceptive about all of this. He's a binocular carrying member of the RSPB. Okay. And he's definitely, really wants to sort of steward his corner of the Cotswolds.
So he's genuine
in the best way that he can. There's no doubt about that. Now, obviously, he's also absolutely brilliant at making TV, and the jeopardy of TV will get created in one form or another. But underneath all of that, yep. Yeah, there's definitely a commitment to leaving it better than he found it.
Okay. That's good. So yeah, my last question was going to be, I mean, it is slightly curveball. We have been kind of, jumping around here. But I wanted to ask about, this is a topic that I'm really interested in, having hit records, like genuine hit records, and the effect that has on, the subsequent music you make, and also, just experience as a person. Because I mean, you guys, the very first records you released were huge, right? I mean, I was going back and listening to the early catalog now, and it's just like the stuff that I didn't realize was you. I was like, shit, this literally has like been burrowed into my mind since the 90s. I didn't even know it was a Groove Armada tune. So talk to me about that, because you said in previous interviews that when you have a hit, people want you to make more of that hit. Basically, want you to make that tune again, sort of.
Yeah.
Enough times that it exhausts the kind of a seam, I suppose, the commercial seam that you've unearthed. Can you just talk, in our last few minutes, just a little bit about, what's it like having a hit, and how does it affect you and your musical output?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a big question really, but I mean, we went from 0 to 0, from 0 to 100, 0 to 10, whatever it is, very quickly, in that, we were doing these parties not far from here. Tim Lovely, Tummy Touch parties, and he asked us to go and make some tunes to promote the parties. For some reason, we went to a country cottage. Neither of us can remember why we did that. One of the tunes that came back from that cottage, thank God we did, because it was in the local shop where I found the CD that had the Patti Page sample on it that's at the river.
Oh, right.
Anyway, but so one of the tunes that came back from that cottage was at the river, and Zoe Ball started playing that on the breakfast show as a kind of bonus tune of choice.
How did that happen? Were you signed to a label already at that point?
It was on Tummy Touch. It's just Tim Lovely. Right. And I don't know, I think because Rob, the order of this is a bit blurred in my mind, but Rob DeBank did a really nice review in Music Magazine, and whether he was instrumental in getting through to Zoe, I can't remember what happened, but it ended up on the breakfast show. And then, I mean, a whole load of things happened, but very, very quickly, in the space of a few months, we went from, being in these sort of East London, carrying the sound system through the wall type parties, to turning up or being made to look like we're turning up at the LA Museum of Flying in a Sopwith Camel and getting out the plane wearing goggles and a scarf and a record. But I mean, complete madness, complete madness. And if you just want to walk 10 meters down the street, you've got to get in a limousine and all this sort of chaos. Yeah. And we were.
You guys were famous, unambiguously famous, right?
For a bit.
Yeah.
And, so, I think what's been an enormous privilege in all that is to have a mate to just really enjoy the total absurdity of it all.
Yeah, right.
And just not see anything more than humor in it. That wasn't to say there were loads of difficult moments, because we were with labels that kept getting bought and A&R people that kept leaving. And, because we didn't make another 12 ICU babies, right, we didn't get the support that we wanted to have. And we had a tough ride with the labels, really tough ride with the labels. But in terms of all the kind of madness of it all, it was nothing other than just, hilarious and quite a lot of fun. But then, and again, I think it's being a duo that allowed us just to push back. So we're not going to do 12 Up the Rivers, 12 ICU Babies, 12 Super Starlings. We're just going to do what we want.
Yeah. I mean, that's the thing, because I mean, the catalogue is extremely varied, actually. It is. I mean, you said you guys have more recently kind of gone back to house music, but there's a lot of different stuff in there. And generally speaking, I mean, we've remarked on the show many times before that, acts aren't generally rewarded for being musically diverse at all. It's like, it's not really in the industry. Maybe you build an audience which values that, but in the industry, that's absolutely not something which people generally speaking like.
Yeah.
Because you like to put an act in a box, and that's what you do. And, so, I mean, how is, I mean, you've mentioned that, had challenges with labels, no doubt that's part of the reason why, but I mean, talk a bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's a combination of good fortune, the era that we were in, and just being a bit dogged. So we've just made this, and it is. If you think about it, like we often did. It would be resident on the Space Terrace on a Sunday, or in any number of like housey, festival-y, contests, just sort of banging it out and loving all of that. whilst most people at that time probably knew us for Out the River. I mean, it's a sort of it's a mad juxtaposition.
Absolutely.
And I think that the bits that really sort of allowed us to ride all of that was investing so much effort and early heartbreak, actually, when it didn't work for a long time, but in like, how do you play dance music with a live band? And that live show, that fusion of all of this stuff really became our signature, and the thing I think of which both of us are most proud. And the other thing we did, which, a lot of people forget, but which was very instrumental in the whole sort of middle years for us, was we set up the Lovebox Festival, which at the time became London's biggest festival. Yeah. And it was just me and Tom and a few mates. It was obviously behind the scenes total chaos, but it became this like amazing thing, and just made us very much part of all these different communities. It kind of made sense of all the madness of our eclecticism.
Right. Yeah. Andy, this has been great. Thanks so much for your time, man. It's been fascinating.
Well, I salute you for the depth and speed of your agricultural research.
Honestly, I mean, it is genuinely, I mean, it's a really, really interesting area, and I think you're doing pretty amazing work in it. So, yeah.
No, pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Music, not diving, with Scuba.